Thank you for staying with us on Citizen Weekend. This week, the U.S. pulled out of the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, known in short as UNESCO, citing several reasons, including anti-Semitism, the UN failing to focus on its core mandate of maintaining peace and security, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals failing to align with its America First policy. The U.S. withdrawal from UNESCO, the latest in a growing list of UN programs it's either pulled out of or stopped funding, including the World Health Organization, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the UN Human Rights Council, and the UN Relief Agency for Palestine Refugees. The World Food Programme, sounding the alarm in April after the Trump administration indicated that funding for emergency food assistance in 14 countries has been terminated. Just this week, the WFP announced that it would be forced to suspend all emergency food and nutrition aid for 1.3 million people in northeast Nigeria at the end of July due to critical funding shortfalls. The number of UN staff operating out of Nairobi is set to grow as a result of these funding cuts, with agencies such as the UN Population Fund moving to Kenya.
To receive services that are now in more expensive locations. And UNICEF will be transferring soon some of the functions to Nairobi, and UNFPA will be essentially moving to Nairobi. Now, the recent cuts that were made in relation to humanitarian aid and development cooperation, and not only by the United States, there were other cuts by other countries, even if in a smaller dimension, naturally have led to the need for agencies that deliver those services to reduce staff. And indeed, thousands of staff have been laid off by several agencies. So but the problem is not for the UN. UN is resilient. The problem is for the people. I mean, if more people will die with HIV/AIDS or with malaria or with TB.
Continued involvement in UNESCO is not in the national interest of the United States. UNESCO works to advance divisive social and cultural causes and maintains an outsized focus on the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, a globalist ideological agenda for international development at odds with our America First foreign policy.
All right, as promised at the start of the news hour, I'm now joined by the director of the UN and Multilateral Diplomacy Crisis Group. His name is Richard Gowan. Richard, thank you for joining us tonight. And this week we've seen the United States pull out of UNESCO, which is, I believe, the third time in history. But prior to this, we saw a pullout from the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Agreement. We've seen the U.S. stop funding to the UN Human Rights Council, the UNRWA, which is the relief agency for Palestine. So how worried should we be by this latest development?
Well, there is obviously a clear pattern here. And the clear pattern is that the United States is walking away from many different parts of the UN. And this does a lot of damage to the UN, both in terms of its political credibility, but also financially, because the US pays a very large percentage of a lot of UN costs. So right now in New York, in Geneva, and other big centers of the UN system, also including Nairobi, I think there is a lot of concern because the UN system as a whole faces a very big financial gap, and it is going to have to cut back a lot of its activities, including life-saving humanitarian work, because the funding is going down.
All right. And what, in your view, would this mean for humanitarian aid, especially considering that there have also been funding cuts to WFP and we saw the US aid close shop?
You know, the US was covering 40 to 50% of the costs of a lot of the big UN humanitarian agencies. Now, there are some ways that the humanitarians can respond to a funding shortfall. There is a lot of duplication in the UN system. There is a lot of waste. And I think that UN officials are getting more serious about saving money and becoming more efficient under US pressure. But I think we have to be really honest with ourselves. If the UN is going to shrink, then it is going to be feeding fewer hungry people. It is going to be sheltering fewer refugees. This does have a genuine human impact around the world. It's not just a problem for well-paid diplomats sitting in big UN buildings.
All right. So we saw the UN Secretary General state that the UN will adapt. There have been staff cuts, but as you've stated, his concern were the people who benefit from these programs. So there is the UN80 Initiative that was launched, and this, as the UN marks 80 years, and part of this is. You hear the rallying call that, it's about cost effectiveness, but also increasing efficiency. So part of what they're looking to do is review mandates to identify where there are overlaps, but also we're going to see some UN agencies shift to lower cost countries such as Kenya. So we're talking about some of the UNICEF's mandate being transferred to Nairobi, as well as the UNFPA. What do you make of that?
Well, I think in the short term, this creates a lot of bureaucratic headaches, as you can imagine. In the medium term, it may be positive. I think that a lot of UN officials are going to be moved closer to the people that they serve, especially in Africa around Kenya. And so this may be an unintended step towards shifting the UN away from big northern centers like the UN in Geneva and opening it up to Africa and the global south. What I would say, though, is I worry that right now the UN is treating this largely as a budget exercise. They're not really discussing the big political question, which is, what do people want the UN to do? Do they want it to focus on peacekeeping? Do they want it to focus on human rights? Do they want it to focus on achieving the sustainable development goals? I think that a lot of UN member states have very different conceptions of what the UN should be focusing on. But right now, no one wants to have that political discussion. And so they're just focusing on cost cuts and moving posts around, which ultimately isn't going to answer the big existential questions that the US is now forcing on the UN.
All right, before we look at the UN and what the different parties believe it should be focused on, when we look at financing, the UN Secretary General has talked about member states not paying in full or not paying on time, and the US is not the only one which has pulled back in terms of funding. What funding options then does that leave the United Nations?
Well, it's really worth noting that the two biggest financial contributors to the main UN budget are the US, but also China. And China has also become quite slow to pay its contributions to the UN in recent years. I think there's one big question, which is, will China see an opportunity here? Will China actually think that this is our chance to gain significantly more influence over the multilateral system? Because if Beijing wanted to, it could fill a lot of the funding gaps that the US is creating. Right now, the Chinese seem a little cautious. It doesn't look like they want to take on the financial burden of supporting the UN, but they could if they wanted. I think that if Chinese money isn't available, then the UN could look for more money from private sources, from foundations like the Gates Foundation. But that isn't going to fill the gap that the American cuts has created. So I'm afraid that the reality is that the UN is going to have to do less with less, and it's going to have to make hard choices about where it is going to cut activities and what its priorities are.
All right, because for instance, when you look at the withdrawal from UNESCO, we had the Democrats on the Foreign Affairs Committee take the view that this will give China an edge, for example, where the development of AI ethics and guidelines are concerned. Do you share that view?
Yes, I think that it is true that UNESCO is a particularly clear example of a UN institution where China has been expanding its influence, and China has been using it as a platform to promote its scientific program. But UNESCO is not alone. There are a lot of other parts of the UN system, especially development-focused parts of the UN system, where China has gained a lot of influence in the last decade. And if the US is not there, then almost inevitably China becomes the top dog in diplomacy in these institutions.
All right. So in terms of the justification provided by the U.S., several reasons. Among them is that, and this was stated by, Tammy Bruce, who's the spokesperson of the U.S. State Department, and she stated that the UN SDGs, for instance, are a globalist ideological agenda for international development at odds with America First. What did you make of that?
Well, I think that the Trump administration isn't actually thinking very hard about the work that the UN does. It doesn't really care. It's putting out these lines because they play well with the domestic audience, the domestic constituency that Trump cares about. And there are a lot of people in the US who have been feeling economic pressure over recent decades, who just don't believe that the US should be focusing on poor people and development beyond the country's borders. And so a lot of this rhetoric is really designed to appeal to a very unhappy Republican base. It sounds strange. It's depressing. I think it's depressing for most other UN members who actually do want the development agenda to move forward. But that is not what Trump cares about.
All right. So Israel welcomed the withdrawal, the U.S. withdrawal from UNESCO, stating that the multilateral arena is plagued with anti-Israel discrimination. How much of the U.S. action, in your view, is informed by that conflict in the Middle East? Because as that happened, we saw France say they will recognize the state of Palestine.
Well, it's definitely true that Republicans in Congress, in particular, have always felt that the UN has a deep bias against Israel. And that does influence actually both Democratic and Republican administrations. But we're at a moment right now with the fighting in Gaza intensifying, where the relationship between Israel and the UN is at a breaking point. The UN has been involved in the Israeli-Palestinian question for nearly 80 years. Israel fundamentally no longer believes that it trusts the UN. UN officials are being profoundly critical of Israeli actions in Gaza. And so we're getting very close to a breakdown. This is a huge, huge crisis, not only for the Palestinians, but also for the UN. And I think the US will continue to side with the Israelis in this battle, and that could have further very negative effects for US relations with the United Nations.
All right, and that brings me to another statement made by the US, and that is the UN's the view that the UN's core mandate was to maintain peace and security, and that should be its focus. But we're seeing, the Middle East conflict. We've seen long-running conflicts on the African continent, in Sudan, for instance. We're seeing in Europe, the Ukraine-Russian conflict has also been going on for quite some time. What does that say about the UN and the peace efforts?
I mean, I think even friends of the UN, and I count myself as a friend of the UN, would admit that the organization has become increasingly marginal in resolving a whole series of recent wars. And it's not just Gaza, it's not just Ukraine. As you say, the UN has been marginal in Sudan, it was marginal during the recent war in Ethiopia. And I think that is mainly because the big powers that dominate in the Security Council, the US, China, and Russia, increasingly cannot agree on what the UN strategies should be. That means the Security Council often gets paralyzed over major crises. And then the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, doesn't feel that he has the political top cover that he requires to act as a mediator in somewhere like Sudan. And so the UN is getting increasingly cautious. It's been focusing a lot more on humanitarian aid, as a band-aid for these wars. But now the money, as we were saying, for humanitarian aid is being taken away. So, the UN really is in a very difficult spot.
So has the UN found itself in a similar position prior to now? Has it been here before?
Yes. I mean, every crisis at the UN feels like it's the end of the institution. But the UN has been around for 80 years, and it's taken a lot of knocks, and it has recovered. I think we should remember that during the Cold War, from the 1940s to the 1980s, the UN was often paralyzed over major crises. There were times when the Security Council didn't even meet for 2 or 3 months at a time. And although tensions are high now, they're still not as bad as they were back during the Cold War. If we look at the post-Cold War period, the UN has had great successes, but it's also had appalling failures, most obviously the failure of UN peacekeepers to stop the Rwandan genocide. What has happened after each of those failures is that member states have got together, they've reflected on the setbacks, they've reflected on the problems, and they have tried to help the UN recover and reform. We don't know how long it will take for the UN to recover from the Trump shock. But I believe that in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the UN will still be there, even if it is probably going to be a smaller UN and perhaps a less ambitious UN after this very bruising experience.
So there's the famous saying that he who pays the piper calls the tune. So the US has been a pretty influential force in the United Nations architecture. I imagine you know better. But could we expect a shift in terms of influence and who will wield influence moving forward?
Yes. If the US continues to withhold money, I think we should note that the European countries, who are also traditionally big donors to the UN, they are not coming forward to fill the gap because they are diverting as much money as they can to defense projects because of their concerns about Russia. So actually, we could be at an interesting inflection point. We see the Western countries moving away from the UN to a certain degree. And that could create a circumstance in which non-Western countries, African countries, Asian countries, step forward and say, you need to give us a bigger leadership role. You need to get a lot more serious about reforming this institution. And if Western countries are not willing to pay, then actually I think, countries from the global South have an opportunity to start playing a much greater role shaping the UN going forward. And again, that may be a necessary correction. This may be a reckoning for the UN and its place in the world that will ultimately prove positive as global power dynamics shift.
All right. Lastly, Richard, before I let you go, how permanent do you think the state of affairs will be in that? When Donald Trump was first in office, there were similar withdrawals from UN agencies that were reversed when Biden came into office. How long-lasting do you see this being, big picture?
So I think this is a considerably worse situation than during the first Trump administration. It is true that the first Trump administration, did pull out of the Paris climate deal. It did have very bad relations with the World Health Organization over COVID. But actually, in his first term, Trump did not do the sort of financial damage to the UN that we have seen over the last 6 months. Now, if we were to get a Democratic administration a few years from now, I think it would reverse some of these cuts. But actually, my general sense is that the US political system as a whole is never going to return to the sort of level of foreign aid and support for the UN that it supported in the past. The US political system is shifting. There is more of a focus across the political spectrum on domestic priorities. And so a future democratic president would be much nicer to the UN, but I don't think that a future democratic president would restore all the funding that we have seen, falling away so rapidly.
All right. Thank you for speaking to us, Richard. And we hope to engage you again. That is Richard Gowan, Director, UN and Multilateral Diplomacy, the Crisis Group. We take a break, but Citizen Weekend continues on the other side.
The decisions, though painful, but in the long run,